So we've actually touched on this a little bit in the talks that have already happened today, and in some of the parallel we looked at yesterday about how design has evolved and where we put our attention. So in 2017, 27 days into the World Wide Web, I think most of us have gotten beyond the point of using lorem ipsum in our designs. Certainly in our prototypes, certainly in the prototypes we test. Not only because sometimes it leads to the tragic comic instance of the unfortunate healthcare.gov where they actually launched with lorem ipsum, but also because it's just not very effective at evaluating our designs and allowing us to get meaningful, actionable feedback from our potential users or from our customers. Now, in moving away from lorem ipsum, there are a couple things that I've seen people trying. One of them is using representational content, so content that is not exactly your final design, but it's closer to what that will eventually look like. And the other one is sort of the gold standard, is in using your actual content, in using the actual words that your website's going to contain when it goes live and that you expect people to interact with. Now, yeah, I'm good, thank you. Now, in principle, this seems like it should be easy enough, right? Instead of putting a whole bunch of gibberish and Greeked out text in your designs, you put in the real words. So easy, right? Unfortunately, when we're dealing with a lot of the prototyping tools and technology available to us today, it puts us in a place of having an update nightmare of dozens of clickable comps, where if we're going to change one word that appears across our entire experience, or a dozen words, or a phrase, or a set of content, we've got to go through and update all of those pieces automatically. Not automatically, manually. Automatically is what we want. It's not what we get. So I recently had the opportunity to work through a method of putting content squarely and semantically at the center of the prototyping process. And that's what I want to share with you today. About how my team and I used a set of available tools and a prototyping process that let us start with content at the center and build that experience around it. And keep the content at the center so that when we needed to make updates, we didn't have to go through that arduous process of comp by comp by comp by comp. And the process is what I want to emphasize today. I am going to show you a tool set, and I'll show you the design that we came up with. But this isn't about a particular set of tools or a particular methodology. It's about trying to evolve the way that we think about the prototyping process and what our prototypes are trying to accomplish. So just as a little bit of preview of where we'll eventually be going, I will, through the course of the presentation, end up at a medium fidelity, content-driven prototype like this one. As a matter of fact, it will be this one. And this is the one we're going to look at. This is our test case. And as you can guess, it starts with content and it keeps content at the center. And I'll walk you through how my team and I were able to accomplish that. But let me start off by putting a little bit more shape and a little more color around the kind of problem this was intending to solve and what we were trying to get around. It's a process that I call find and replace and despair. Last year, 2 years ago, I was working with the team on an e-commerce site for a municipal services client. It was a service provider of waste and disposal utilities for home and business. And what they asked us to do was to introduce a guided selling path into their product catalog. So we started off. They started off with just a basic product catalog where you could choose between these different disposal options. And what we introduced was a way for the user to get some help in what kind of product they needed, what kind of capacity, what kind of pickup schedule, all of these other elements. From there, of course, we wanted to make sure that they could select a product and then select more products if they wanted to, because they've been selling, more is better. Get that into their shopping cart, and then finally check out, complete the e-commerce flow and become a magical conversion. So what we found in creating this clickable prototype, and we created this in Sketch and InVision, was that the problems that users were having were not so much in moving from screen to screen or how the content elements were blocked out on individual screens. The problems they were having were in the little pieces of microcopy that translated across the whole sequence of screens. So with this particular product, one of the additional challenges, in addition to the guided selling path we were introducing, was that with this kind of service, customers historically had a hard time figuring out what they were going to pay, what the penalty was if they stopped their service early, what a service contract was and what it obligated them to, and what they were getting. There was enough complexity in this system that some people got to the end of this process and were incredibly incensed because now it was costing twice as much and they were getting half the service. It turns out that this client, and I think we can say the most of many clients with good intentions, wasn't trying to bilk anybody. They just had a complex system and they didn't quite know how to organize it. Well, it turns out that the features that led to that understanding were these little bits of microcopy. So as designers, of course, we look at this and we think, okay, well, I've got 5 screens here that my user needs to be able to navigate through. When in reality, when we started to test this, users who were representing their own needs and making decisions as they would as consumers in a market navigated through dozens of screens. So you have a family of 1 versus a family of 5, you need a different product. You have one type of business versus another, you need a different product. So our prototype ended up being not the 5 screens of the flow we were testing, but the 60 screens that represented the different choices that our users might make. Now, as designers and as people building prototypes, sometimes we'll limit those and we'll say, well, to someone in a test scenario, if you've ever been in this situation, okay, well, pretend you only have 1 kid instead of 4, right? Or pretend that you live in a smaller house. What would you do then? And at that point, you're not actually running a user test. You're asking someone to guess what answer you think they should say. And that's even hard to say, let alone to get good insight out of. So when we end up in a situation like this, and what we're testing are the little bits of information that build a user's understanding throughout the flow, now if we want to iterate on this, we want to test and we want to learn, we've got 60 different screens to update. And this becomes, if you've ever done this, an update hell. Long about this time, and this was how we ended up working with this process. It wasn't terribly effective. Along this time, I was rereading Emotional Design by Don Norman, and I was reminded of a framework that he puts together for how people process information. And this provided a framework for rethinking this process and how we approach this process of building this understanding over time. Norman's framework of processing involves 3 levels: the visceral level, the behavioral level, and the reflective level. On the visceral level, this is a place where we make rapid judgments about what's good, what's bad, things that are safe and dangerous, good looking, not good looking. We even make judgments about things that work well and things that don't work well, often based on how they look. The visceral level, for the most part, transcends culture, and it happens instantaneously. We automatically have a visceral reaction. I don't know what this little motorized dinosaur running around the conference is. But I know it's been, I've seen it sort of in the hallway, and I notice in the context of saying this now that my visceral reaction to that is, oh, that's cute. I don't have to know anything about it. Maybe it's going to kill us all during the break. I don't know, but we have a visceral reaction to it, and I think others probably do too. So that's the first level of processing. The second level of processing is behavioral, and these are our well-learned routine operations. Now, the example I like to give here is in driving a stick shift. But I'm told that people don't learn to drive stick shifts anymore. Is that true? Who drives a stick shift? Oh, okay. Well, that was bad information. I'm going to stick with this. So think of it also like riding a bicycle if you don't drive a stick shift. When you learn the process, it's arduous. And you have to spend a lot of time burning out mom and dad's clutch in order to get it right. But then once you get it right, you don't have to think about it anymore. It's well learned, it's a routine operation, like riding a bicycle or like, no idea where my phone went, but think about the interactions that we use on our devices as well. When Apple remapped the home button on the iPhone, I was incensed, right? Yes. Like, oh, it doesn't do what I think it does. Still even. Some people have never gotten over it. But as I was thinking about this as an example, so this is a behavioral interaction. As I was thinking about this as an example, it occurred to me, I can't even remember what the home button used to do before I was mad about it changing, because that has been reintegrated into how I operate with that device. So this is behavior level. The last level that Norman talks about is the reflective level. And this is the level that's sensitive to experience, to training, and to education. This is where we have to figure out a new process or understand a new system or make a decision about a product that we don't buy very often and have maybe never bought before. And that's the case of the flow that I just showed you a moment ago with an e-commerce flow for waste management services from a municipality. Not something we buy very often, and something that you need to use your experience with buying other products, with dealing with garbage, use your education, and figure out. So this is the area that in the prototype we just looked at that we were testing. We were testing and trying to learn and iterate on the reflective level of processing. So I cover this and I spend a little bit of time here because in reflecting back on our process and thinking about the tools that we use to prototype, my team and I arrived at the conclusion that most of the tools we have work really well across the visceral and the behavioral. And they're in all of the tools that I show here, so Proteo, Principle, Sketch and Envision, which the prototype I just showed you was built on, or Axure, are all excellent tools for this area. They help us gauge visual design, so our visceral reaction. You can create a really high fidelity prototype in Sketch or Photoshop for that matter, drop it into InVision and have something that impacts your users viscerally. You can map all the behaviors that we use on mobile devices to gauge how people would move through that application. What they don't do very well is help us get an understanding of the area that crosses the behavioral and the reflective. So when we're asking someone to learn a new thing, right, or learn about a new product, in something like, for example, in buying disposal services, if you're a homeowner or a business owner, you shouldn't be an expert in this. And sometimes if you call customer service, they say, well, how could you not possibly know that an 18-yard container can hold 3 dump trucks worth of garbage? Right? Why would you know that? So what we need to map is, or what we need to test is, how do we build that reflective understanding over time? And essentially what we're building in a flow like that, and in these kinds of flows, are systems of meaning and systems of understanding. And our users don't do that on individual screens. They do it from screen to screen. So the way the system works and the way that we build the system through interactions, but more importantly, through language, is important. And it's something that when you're designing a system for someone else, takes some time to tune in. So in the short and pithy book, Systematics, John Gall makes the comment that a complex system that works is invariably found to have evolved from a simple system that works. A lot of us, if we design for the web or we design for applications that talk to any other applications, whether it's social or networks or intranets, we're working in large systems. And those are invariably hard to wrangle. But we're usually starting with small systems and with simple systems. If we can get those right, then our chances of integrating that with a larger system and having that work go up exponentially. And that's the piece that a new approach will help us focus on. So in reframing our prototyping process in this way, my team and I arrived at some opportunities that were out there, that were latent in the kind of design work that we do, but that we weren't able to capitalize on yet. One of these was being able to test and iterate across behavioral and reflective processing. The second was to learn from and build simple language systems that work across an experience, not simply on a single page. Now, from these two opportunities, which I hope are fairly manifest from the discussion that I've led you through so far, we arrived at two more opportunities. One of these was being able to encourage clients to work with content earlier in the design process. The tools, and I'm gonna pick on Sketch and Envision a little bit because it's the one that I've used the most, right? Because it's a great tool. But asking a client to dig into your sketch files with you and help you sort through your labels and your microcopy is like pulling teeth. Right? It's a tool that you're familiar with, the client's not familiar with that. It's a difficult environment to work in. Likewise, in working collaboratively on content and structure with other team members like project managers or researchers, as well as working with clients. So these 4 opportunities, this working at a different level of processing, of thinking about our design as systems, and particularly systems of language, not just screens, and then working with content earlier and collaboratively were the things that we wanted to capitalize on. And the reason I point this out is that there are a million prototyping tools out there, and there are a million more every day. So delving into a new process of doing this wasn't something that my team or I took lightly. We wanted there to be a good reason that we were doing this, and we felt like these opportunities were one of those reasons. So, having identified some opportunities, we wanted to, before we started getting into technology, make it clear what we were trying to accomplish. So we set out a couple goals for ourselves. One was that we wanted to create a flexible, collaborative environment in which to test, learn, and iterate quickly. We wanted to build that environment with lightweight, open source resources. And the lightweight is so that we can easily bring them into our project and open source so that they don't add additional cost, right? Or we don't have restrictions on what we can use with particular clients. And then for our final goal, we wanted to make sure that we built a system or a method that was as transparent as possible in order to model and communicate the functioning of the system. And this last point is important when we're talking about systems. Systems theorist Gerald Weinberg writes in an introduction to general systems thinking that he writes about the white box model, that instead of being the inside of the system being perfectly hidden, it's perfectly revealed, a white box rather than a black box. I would argue that tools like, particularly when we think about how our content is structured and how it's put together, tools like Sketch and Envision or Axure are black boxes. So we can think to ourselves, okay, well, I've got a piece of content here, and now I have a bunch of related links that pop up over here. And we can just write those links out and then put the box there with absolutely no knowledge of what has to happen or how our content has to be structured in order to make those links appear when a user selects that particular content item, right? Or how what kind of metadata we need to have accompanying our content in order to make recommendations. If we can break open that black box and actually use our iterative prototyping process to learn about both our users' needs and about our content, we can then gain some insight and look into that white box, as it were, in order to learn how our system works and design it more effectively. So with these goals in mind, we came up with an approach. The approach starts with, as you might suspect, content. And in this case, we're starting with structured content. So, and this is following in the most rudimentary way Carey McGrane's idea of content packages, where your content isn't just a blob of words, but it's actually a title. You'll have a summary paragraph, maybe a short summary paragraph, and you'll have the description, you'll have a category and tag. So this is all your content package, and it's structured content. From there, we add some structure around it, and the probably the most widespread tool, big shocker, for adding structure to structured content is HTML. Right? HTML are tags you put around a piece of content to say, hey, this is a header, this is a paragraph, this is a list. It's out there, it's fairly common, you may have heard of it, I don't know. From there, we add style so that our users who are testing our prototype can understand what the structured content is, and then we serve it to the device that they're using already. Now, you'll recognize this as basically the World Wide Web. Right? These are how web pages are built. But of course, our goal wasn't to go through and just build a whole bunch of web pages, because if you're going to build something for production, you've got build systems and compatibility, and your content's locked in a database, and there's all sorts of things that make that 8 full-time jobs, right? None of which I know how to do. So we did want to keep, however, this basic approach to keeping content first, because the web, if you think about it, is a content-first medium. Everything starts with the word that the tags are wrapped around and styled and then served up. But somehow in our design process, we lost that. We start with boxes, and we start with filler text, and then we fill the words in later, which is backwards. So we wanted to re-forwards it, unbackwards it, whatever. And the way that we approached that was by taking these basic levels and then bringing to them pieces of technology that made them transparent and made them collaborative. For content, and this might seem a little more backwards to you, we used Excel. Now, given the example that I just showed you of we're basically using the web to prototype, you might be thinking, well, but content these days usually lives in a database, right? Or usually lives in an API. But that doesn't meet our goals, and it doesn't allow us to collaborate easily. Spreadsheets, as miserable as they can be, are usually where content ends up in the iterative phase. And this is a content audit that I did years ago, and if I were to do one again, I would do it the same way. It's all done in Excel. When I get content from clients, so the product that we were just looking at the beginning, their product list existed in an Excel spreadsheet. This is how they know how to think about it. And it's an easy way for me to communicate both with clients and with my team. It's also, because of Microsoft Live or Google Docs, an easy way to collaborate with customers. That you can be looking at the same spreadsheet on a phone call and making decisions about content and about labels and about categories. So once we have our content, we wanted to structure that. Now, of course, we could just build HTML, but now you're getting into a different skill set. So what we elected to do was use Jekyll, which is a flat file content management system. Basically, what Jekyll allows us to do is to insert our content into simple templates that are built on the fly and can combine logic to make basic decisions about content. And I am going to show you an example of this. For style, we use Foundation. You could also use Bootstrap. Again, we could also have written, well, somebody could have written, I'm not very good at it, somebody could have written the CSS from the ground up. But if you're building a medium fidelity prototype, something like Foundation or Bootstrap, it has buttons, it has a size, it has all your headers, it has warning text, it has all of those things already made. All you have to do is drop them in. And then finally, we serve the whole thing up with Browser Sync, which is a Node program, I think, that basically takes anything running on your machine and serves it up to any other devices on the same Wi-Fi network. We tied the whole thing together with Gulp, which is a JavaScript task runner, which sounds very fancy, but it's actually really simple. So that anytime you update any piece of this stack, the whole thing updates and it gets served to a server. So what that looks like is that our Excel document that houses all of our content is converted into JSON and Markdown. That JSON and Markdown is then pulled in by Jekyll and through its configuration file. The JSON and Markdown is combined with modular includes, and modular includes are just a fancy way of saying our navigation, our header, and our footer. Put into HTML templates and then optionally combined with logic to create a navigable website, a static navigable website. We styled this simply with using Foundation and then served it up responsively to whatever device the user is on. And that's the whole process. Okay, so let me show you an example. So that's the high level, that's the approach and how we put it together. So as an example in action, I'm going to take the City of Seattle's Green Lake Community Center. A, because they have some dire problems, but B, because it's a lovely place, and C, because it's an example I can talk with you about in entirety, and actually in the framework that I'm going to show you, this is the example I have online. So if you want to dig in and play with it, you can play with all of this stuff. So the Green Lake Community Center offers classes, events, and recreation space for the Green Lake neighborhood, my neighborhood, by the way. And they have a website that actually doesn't look like this anymore. They've done a visual update since I took this screenshot a couple months ago. But it has all of the same information on it. It looks better, but it doesn't do anything different. You can learn about classes on this website, and you do so by clicking a link that opens up a PDF. You can find the class that you're interested in. It's a very lovely PDF. You can find the class that you're interested in, and then you go back to the website, and you click on a link to the ordering system, and then you find the index number, and you get the picture. It's awful. but it's a great service. So the community center is a great service. So the goal that I set myself in this test example was, okay, how do we move to a responsive online solution that better meets the needs of the City of Seattle Green Lake Community Center's patrons, right, or potential patrons? In a project like this, we would, of course, start with discovery, some interviews, quickly could move into exploratory sketching, which is what I did. And then from the sketch phase, since we have the content, even if it's not final content, and even if it'll have to be changed, and it will, once we have some sketches, we can actually move right into a rapid prototyping process. So, as I just mentioned, we'll start with a spreadsheet. And in this case, this is where our structured content is housed. So each column is a label for a piece of the structured content. So the first, I don't know if you can read it where you are, but our first column is the title. Then we have the description in column B. We have the category in column C, tags in column D, and then an image link in column E. Each one of these rows is a separate content package. You could think about it that way. What happens with this content is our Jekyll template has some very basic tags in it. And these tags are page.title, page.description, page.category, and page.tags. This is how we get the content into the template. Now, so that we can actually read it, I've put some basic paragraph tags around each one of those content tags. Otherwise, it would just show up as a continuous paragraph. But the way that it works is that we just enter content into our spreadsheet, and then as you save the spreadsheet, it populates in the browser. So that's the very beginning of our content-first prototype. It starts with just words in a web browser, the most basic way we could lay it out. Now, of course, one page doesn't get us very far, so we're going to add in some additional pages. And as you add in additional rows, those then, you save them, and they consequently populate as additional pages in this prototype. So now we're able to populate the entire PDF in a HTML, a set of HTML documents just by adding these rows to the spreadsheet. And now the Green Lake Community Center has about 60 different classes that they offer. But just to see if I could break this, I loaded in a product catalog of about 300, and I ended up with 300 pages. So it's robust enough. So from here, we're going to add in some structure. So we'll go over to our HTML template, and all I'm going to do is add the tags in that say, well, this is a header, this is a paragraph, this is a bulleted list. And that'll update. From here, we can start, at the structure phase, we can start to add in some logic. So our rows of content elements can be exported as pages, but we can also comb through that set of pages and pull out, say, for instance, individual links. So here I'm adding in a for loop, which says basically for this set of content, go through and find all the links, and then list them as an unordered list. Now, for those of you that are panicking right now because I just said for loop, calm down. Jekyll offers a couple things like the for loop and if-then statements that allow you to bring really advanced, sophisticated levels of logic into your prototypes with some really simple tools, particularly if you combine them at a couple levels. One of the reasons that we chose Jekyll and Foundation is because they have very supportive communities and excellent documentation. If you spend a half hour with documentation on the for loops, you will know everything there is to know about for loops. They're super simple. And I'm actually glad this came up yesterday. Emma Rose's comment was that everybody should learn the basics of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, enough to politely be able to ask where the bathroom is. That's the level of language that we're learning here, is where's the for loop bathroom is all you need to know. If you need any additional help on desire to get your head around HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, Eric Spiekerman, type design legend, has also said that you have to learn, if not to code, at least to appreciate code and to understand it. Code is what nuts and bolts were 100 years ago to the printing press. So it's good practice. All right, enough of that rant. So once we have our semantic structure in place, we want to add some style in order to make this intelligible to our users. And we'll do that simply by, can't tell when this is updating, simply by adding in CSS classes. So again, Foundation, it gives you buttons, it gives you asides, it gives you a lot of these styles ready-made. Now, this side actually I toned down a little bit, but if you build this just to Foundation or Bootstrap styles, you'll get a site that looks very generic. It will look like a Bootstrap site, which for a medium fidelity prototype is perfect. For a production site, and a lot of production sites do this, not so perfect. But for what we're doing, this is really as far as I would go. Now, at this point, if we want to add in additional content, so let's say we want to put our image in there, or we want to add in some other headers, we can make a change to any other piece of this template, and it will automatically update because it's all threaded together. And then, of course, our last step is to access it via the URL that we get through Browser Sync, and now you can get to it on whichever device you happen to be on. So where does this leave us? For the kind of project that I started off with, where we had a home page, a category page, and a set of product pages, we ended up with dozens of screens. Because all of our content has been populated through a spreadsheet and generated automatically, we have those dozens of screens so that we can navigate this flow. We can also iterate on it. When I want to update my labels, or I want to update the length of my paragraphs, all I need to do is update the spreadsheet or update my templates, and it updates the whole thing. Another advantage here is that if I want to test out different versions of, say, a home page or a product page, all I have to do is copy that file and then make my adjustments, right? Or create a branch if you're into Git. Either way. What that does is allow us to take a system like this and take a prototype question like this and iterate on the language, iterate on the way that our users build understanding across a series of pages in a way that the system itself makes it easy to do because all of your updates happen here. It also means that if I'm on the phone with a client or I'm on site with a client and they want to see what a flow looks like with a different set of labels or a different length of introductory paragraph, we can make that update right away and then take it around in the hall and see how people react or set up another study. Part of the goal of this is to be able to get to a place where we can build systems and we can build ways for users to move through those systems where we can iterate on this system of understanding that happens. Now, this isn't going to be the right solution for every prototyping project, just like Axure or InVision or Balsamiq or coding something by hand from HTML isn't the right solution for every prototyping project. But what we found in the example that I showed was that there is a gap, and there was a set of opportunities in that gap, and this is the approach that we took to meet those opportunities. So allowing us to test and iterate across the behavioral and the reflexive, creating simple language systems that work, working with content earlier and working collaboratively on that content. So what does this mean for you? Maybe this kind of project and maybe the tool I showed you would work well, but maybe it wouldn't. The takeaway that I hope you take away from this is that if you're finding that you're in Axure, you're in Sketch, and something that you're doing, like testing microcopy across a series of pages, is a pain in the ass, so much so that you just don't want to do it. You would rather wait for the thing to launch and then let them iterate on it later on. Think through a different process. Think through the tools that you have at your disposal or the simple things that you can learn in order to shake that process up. We have a lot of great tools for prototyping right now. Many of them are built from a visual design foundation. Many of the things we do on the web stem from a language foundation, right? Or an interaction foundation, or a speech foundation, right? This is the next thing that's coming. As you get started, think about the goals for your project and what you're trying to accomplish with the testing and with the research that you're doing. So for us, it was to be flexible and collaborative, to use lightweight open source tools, and to be as transparent as possible. And then think about the approach that will help you get to those goals. Now, maybe it's something that's built on a basic web structure like this. Maybe you work with a product that has a CMS or has a build system you can tap into. Right? Is there a way that you can create a dummy API that you can tie into your build system to allow you to iterate on language with clients and do it in real time? I don't know what your systems are, but think about this. This isn't the only solution, but the solutions to get to the kind of knowledge we want are out there, and they're not that difficult. So if you would like to use the structure I just showed you, you can check it out on GitHub, and I will tweet out this deck right after this session, so you'll have all of these links as well as the slides, which I could have told you at the start, but didn't. I would also recommend looking into Jekyll. Their documentation is excellent, and the community is actually really supportive, as well as their foundation, also a great community around there. And they have some great classes too. If you're still terrified of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, as I know some of you probably are, because I was at this time last year, I can't recommend any resource better than A Book Apart. I put 6 books up here, which might look terrifying, but each one of these is about 90 pages long and takes 2 hours to get through. They're also really well written. If you haven't looked at A Book Apart yet, look into this. It will get you to the point where you can ask for the bathroom in any one of these languages. And that's all I have for you. Thank you. And I believe we have time for questions if anybody has them. If you don't, I'll be surprised, because that was a lot of stuff. Yes?
I haven't looked at your scripts or anything, but have you considered like adding CSS as like a separate column in the Excel spreadsheet instead of?
Oh, that's a good question. I haven't considered it. I'm considering it right now, and I wouldn't do it. Here's why. Because then you're mixing in the style with the content. If the approach that we took was really to break those things out as far as we could, so that when we were looking at content, we weren't worried about what it was styled as. Part of that is because we wanted to arrive at a content system that worked for the customers or the users we were building for. Theoretically, you could, and there's no reason you couldn't, but that would be the reason I wouldn't. But for a different project, for example, one that had, God forbid, inflexible styles, like their CSS was like cast in stone. I don't know why that would be the case, but that might be a reason to do that. But yeah, the purpose of this spreadsheet is really to keep the content separate and to keep it in a format that is as universally accessible as we can make it. Yes?
Can you talk a little bit about how it went with the client and sort of just any conclusions you came out with, things that worked?
Yeah, I can't with that client. Alas, hence all the gray boxes. I can talk about some times that I've used this, and this I think is an important point. I've used elements of this system that didn't go end to end. So I presented to you in an example of we start with content and then we go all the way through to a functional prototype. But I've also used just this spreadsheet compiled onto pages that clients could see where we didn't actually test and where we're using very minimal CSS so that we could iterate on those kinds of changes. And the other benefit of that was that once I put and this was a client who didn't have their content in a spreadsheet, once I put all their content in a spreadsheet and then syntax highlighted all the places they were missing content or categories or tags or descriptions, and they could see that their spreadsheet had all of these blotches of red on it, that was a really good motivator to get them to fill in the rest of those pieces. So even if your end goal isn't to go out and test in the community with a prototype, pieces of this, and that's just good content strategy actually, but pieces of this can be useful in helping bring content closer to the surface in your projects and in working with your clients. Yes?
In your example, it looks like your content itself is pretty kind of well organized or structured because it's from a catalog.
Uh-huh.
So how would you go about if the content is not well organized? It's kind of everywhere. How would you move from the content phase to structure?
Yeah, by structuring the content. And it's a good question. Karen McGrain Karen McGrain also has a book on A Book Apart, Content Strategy for Mobile, which is more about content strategy than it is about mobile, because mobile is everything these days. But she talks very explicitly. Sarah Wachter-Betcher also has an excellent book called Content Everywhere, about moving from unstructured content, which is how a lot of content exists now. It's what Karen McGrain calls blobs, where you've got a WYSIWYG and everything's entered into your WYSIWYG and it's just a big blob of content. The way of moving from a blob to a content package is by taking apart the blob. To my knowledge, there isn't an automatic way that we can process that because it relies on a human taking it apart and saying, oh, well, this is a summary paragraph, this is a product detail, this is a price list. So it's a manual process, but it's one that I would argue, and I think the content strategist would agree with me, and you can disagree if you don't, but that it pays dividends. It's hard, it's just a lot of slogging through and doing the work, but it's work worth doing. And then it allows you to do things like this. Yes?
Kind of a related question to that. Have you used this situation where you might have different kinds of structured content, but the content objects themselves are different? They don't
Yeah.
the same.
Yeah, and I'm probably going to regret this because live demos are, they're rife with, well, peril. See, there we go, peril already. So in this particular spreadsheet, and this is the Green Lake Community Center sheet, each one of the tabs at the bottom is a different content type. So we've got, for example, this is the class list. I also have a directory content type that has different kinds of packages, and you could theoretically have as many of these tabs as you want. This also has, anybody who's interested in playing with this, the global navigation is also built into the spreadsheet itself. So if we want to try out a different, it's a slide out, a drawer menu, we want to try out a different menu, you can just change it here. Yes?
I'm going to try and structure the content of what I want to put across. But so a lot of the tools that you use today, like for interaction stuff like InVision, sort of generates the code for you, like the styling, the HTML, CSS sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Have you guys like tried to or thought about how this would? And you mentioned like this is at the stage of being like a medium fidelity prototype.
Right.
But have you thought about how like you would be able to reuse the code or the information that you guys are putting in, like at the implementation stage?
Yeah.
Because obviously the people creating this, are not like developers or do not
Yeah.
know code, and I feel like the developers would also like rather get like system developed code rather than from like a designer or someone who's not code savvy.
Yeah.
And so like they'd have to like sort of recreate this entire thing that you've spent putting into like an Excel sheet.
Right. So that's a good question. Basically, how could you recycle the code or what could you do to reuse the
Is
code?
there even scope for that? Because is it at that stage of being good enough for that?
Yeah. And this code isn't intended for that. When I built this prototype with the other prototypes I've worked on, I wanted them to work on Chrome and nothing else. There's no, Foundation has some cross-browser stuff built into it, but I largely ignore it because it's just a prototype. It just needs to work on the devices that we're testing on. The thing that it will give you for developers, though, is that structured content. So that if I have, for instance, a set of categories here, and I want to be able to pull up, let's say that I'm on, I don't know, classes for people that are 18 and plus, right? Or classes that are for people from 3 to 6, right? Knowing that my content has to be structured in a way that calls those divisions out and calls them out in a meaningful way that makes sense to users means that with that structured content, I can pull those elements out to build it into logic to create those pages. Now, what an actual developer will use to build these pages is probably not Jekyll, right? They'll have, automation magic things that I can't wrap my head around. But if I don't break out the content in a way that works for the logic that I've designed, they're going to have to do that. Or they'll have to come up with some workaround if the content's already locked up in an API somewhere. So although I would never, and part of this is that I have enough respect for the developers I work with that I would never presume to tell them how to develop. But I can tell them the basic logic of how the content fits together and how it's designed so that our users can understand it. And then from they have an understanding of what the system is supposed to do, and they can work their magic and make it do it fast. and reliably. Okay, I think that's us being out of time. Thank you very much.